Welcome. This lesson studies the modern exchange variation move orders, beginning with the delayed queen exchange after 8 castle kingside and then comparing the immediate queen exchange alternatives. White plays d4, claims central space, and gives the queen's pawn structure a clear starting point. Notice that every later decision begins with this central claim. It also reserves e4 for a second pawn, so black must challenge the center rather than attack a single pawn. Black plays knight f6, attacking the center. The knight attacks e4 and d5 indirectly, so white must establish the center with support rather than advance it carelessly. White plays c4, increasing central control. Together with d4 it restrains, e5 e4 and makes a later c-pawn capture on d5 possible. Black plays g6, preparing bishop g7. Black intends to attack the center from the long diagonal instead of occupying it with pawns immediately. White plays knight c3, preparing the broad pawn center. The knight supports e4, but its placement also means black will later look for pressure against d4. Black plays bishop g7, activating the king's Indian bishop. From g7 the bishop will become stronger whenever the center opens, especially after exchanges on e5. White plays e4, building the central pawn pair. White now has more space, but the d4 pawn becomes the fixed point black will attack. Black plays d6, supporting the central break. This keeps e5 protected after the central exchange and prevents white from chasing the knight with e5 too early. White plays knight f3, reinforcing e5 control. Black castles kingside. Black keeps the rook ready for the d-file once the d-pawn leaves d6. White plays bishop e2, keeping the structure flexible. The bishop avoids committing to a diagonal before white knows whether the center will close or be exchanged. Black plays e5, challenging the center. Black challenges white before the center can advance to d5 and restrict the g7 bishop. White takes e5 and chooses the exchange variation structure. White removes black's central pawn and asks whether black's piece activity compensates for the quieter structure. Black takes e5, opening the central files. White removes black's central pawn and asks whether black's piece activity compensates for the quieter structure. Before the delayed castling main line, study white's immediate queen exchange. These alternatives explain why move order matters and why the main line keeps more tension. White removes black's central pawn and asks whether black's piece activity compensates for the quieter structure. White takes d8 with the queen. The exchange changes the priority from king attacks to rook activity, knight outposts, and pawn weaknesses. Black takes d8 with the rook. The rook immediately occupies the open file, which is black's compensation for having less central space. White takes e5, testing whether the pawn can be held. The pawn can be taken only because white has calculated the counterstrike, nx e4 and the resulting piece activity. Black takes e4 with the knight, striking the center at once. Black attacks the central pawn at the moment white's knight has left f3, forcing white to calculate rather than simply keep material. White takes e4 with the knight. Black attacks the central pawn at the moment white's knight has left f3, forcing white to calculate rather than simply keep material. Black takes e5 with the bishop, restoring material while activating the bishop pair. The bishop recaptures toward the center, activating the bishop pair and opening the e-file for the rook. White castles kingside and prepares rook activity. Black keeps the rook ready for the d-file once the d-pawn leaves d6. Black plays knight c6, improving the remaining knight. White plays bishop g5, increasing pressure on e7 and f6. The pin makes nx d5 less automatic and increases the tactical value of a white knight jump to d5. Black plays rook e8, contesting the open file. The rook stands behind the bishop on e5, so a bishop move can uncover an attack on white's knight e4. White plays bishop f3, keeping the bishop active before black wins time on it. More importantly, the bishop now protects the knight on e4, so black's discovered attack idea no longer wins that knight. Black takes b2 with the bishop. The queenside pawn becomes compensation for white's active rooks. The pawn grab is justified only if the bishop can escape and black's active pieces compensate for the time spent moving it. White plays rook a b1, attacking the bishop and using the open b-file. The rook gains a tempo on the bishop and turns the b-file into practical compensation for the pawn. Black retreats bishop g7, preserving the bishop pair. From g7 the bishop will become stronger whenever the center opens, especially after exchanges on e5. White plays knight f6 check, forcing a structural decision. The check forces black to decide whether to exchange a defender or allow white's knight to disrupt the rook and bishop coordination. Black takes f6 with the bishop. White takes f6 with the bishop and keeps active pieces. Black is counting on the extra pawn and the healthier pawn structure. White's compensation is the bishop pair and initiative, so white must keep creating threats before black consolidates. Back after rook takes d8, white can try knight d5. Black's answer shows why the d5 square is never a permanent gift. The rook immediately occupies the open file, which is black's compensation for having less central space. White plays knight d5, centralizing before black can occupy d4. The move challenges black before d4 becomes permanent and often forces a structural decision with nx d5. Black takes d5 with the knight. Black eliminates the knight because allowing it to remain would expose c7 and f6 and restrict the bishops. White takes d5 with the c-pawn. If white recaptures with e takes d5 instead of the bishop, black's thematic follow-up is e5 to e4, gaining space and disrupting white's pieces. Black plays c6, challenging the advanced pawn. Black invites d takes c6, after the recapture, the knight develops with tempo instead of remaining on its original square. White takes c6. Black has induced the pawn exchange, but now the recapture develops a previously inactive knight with tempo. Black takes c6 with the knight. The knight becomes active immediately, so white has not won a useful pawn structure, black has gained development and pressure. Back after c6, white's main move is bishop c4. The bishop's job is not only development, it restrains black's e5 to e4 advance. The break attacks d5 and opens the c-file, black uses it before white's space becomes a lasting bind. White plays bishop c4, developing with activity. The bishop also restrains black's intended e5 to e4 advance after the central exchanges. Black takes d5 with the c-pawn, challenging white to choose the right recapture. The capture removes white's central space and gives black open lines for rooks and bishops. White takes d5 with the e-pawn, preserving the bishop's diagonal but allowing black a forcing space gain. Black advances e4. This attacks white's pieces, gains space, and explains why bishop c4 was needed to make this plan less comfortable. White now has more space, but the d4 pawn becomes the fixed point black will attack. Back after bishop c4, white usually recaptures with the bishop after black takes d5. This keeps the e-pawn in place and avoids giving black the immediate e4 advance. Black takes d5 with the c-pawn. If white recaptures with e takes d5 instead of the bishop, black's thematic follow-up is e5 to e4, gaining space and disrupting white's pieces. White takes d5 with the bishop, keeping an active diagonal. The bishop recaptures on an active diagonal and prevents black from consolidating the d-file without opposition. Black plays knight d7, improving the final minor piece. White castles kingside. Black keeps the rook ready for the d-file once the d-pawn leaves d6. Black plays h6, asking the bishop to decide. White plays rook d1, contesting the open d-file. Black plays rook e8, bringing the rook into the center. After the two alternatives, we reach the main immediate queen exchange test, bishop g5 and rook e8. First, examine black's tactical knight jump before returning to the normal continuation. The rook immediately occupies the open file, which is black's compensation for having less central space. White plays bishop g5, pinning the knight and supporting the d5 jump. The pin makes nx d5 less automatic and increases the tactical value of a white knight jump to d5. Black plays rook e8, reinforcing e5 and keeping the position compact. White plays knight d5, using the pin to improve the knight. The move challenges black before d4 becomes permanent and often forces a structural decision with nx d5. Black takes d5 with the knight. Black eliminates the knight because allowing it to remain would expose c7 and f6 and restrict the bishops. White takes d5 with the c-pawn. The capture removes white's central space and gives black open lines for rooks and bishops. Black plays c6, challenging the advanced pawn immediately. The break attacks d5 and opens the c-file, black uses it before white's space becomes a lasting bind. White plays bishop c4, keeping pressure while completing development. Black takes d5 with the c-pawn. The capture removes white's central space and gives black open lines for rooks and bishops. White takes d5 with the bishop. The bishop recaptures on an active diagonal and prevents black from consolidating the d-file without opposition. Black plays knight d7, preparing the final piece coordination. White plays knight d2, reinforcing central squares and preparing to castle long. Black plays knight c5, increasing pressure on d3 and e4. White castles queenside and sets a tactical test. Black must not greedily chase material with the knight, because white's rook placement can trap the knight and recover material with forcing bishop checks. White chooses the safer side of the immediate tactical threats and puts a rook on d1 at once. Black plays knight d3 check instead of the steadier bishop e6. This begins the greedy line that lets white activate the d-file rook against the knight. The check exploits the fact that the knight on c5 can fork key squares while white's king has just castled long. White plays king b1, keeping the king out of the central files. Black takes f2 with the knight and falls for the trap. The knight appears to attack the h1 rook, but its escape squares are now controlled by white's active pieces. Black wins a pawn with tempo on the rook, so white must respond by activating rooks and bishops immediately. White plays rook df1. This is the only winning rook move. It attacks the knight on f2 while leaving the h-file rook available for the tactical sequence. Black cannot keep the material. This is the point of white's setup. The d-file rook attacks the knight on f2 while preserving the h-file rook for the tactical recapture sequence. Black takes h1, but the knight is stranded. White now has forcing checks and can recover the rook on e8, leaving black without a workable material escape. Taking the rook commits black's knight to the corner and allows white's bishops to recover material with forcing checks. White takes f7 with check. The check forces the king aside and clears the bishop's route to e8. The check opens the diagonal to e8 and is the tactical reason white can justify allowing the rook capture. Black plays king h8, avoiding further checks. White takes e8 with the bishop, restoring material balance through activity. White removes black's rook and converts the tactical sequence into a material balance that must be assessed precisely. The knight jump is the tactical exception. Back at the common position, black's normal continuation develops the bishop and seeks a stable minor piece ending. White chooses the safer side of the immediate tactical threats and puts a rook on d1 at once. Black plays bishop e6, developing with tempo and preparing to exchange active pieces. The bishop develops with tempo against the rook and prepares to trade the bishop that controls key light squares. White takes e6 with the bishop. White exchanges before black's bishop can dominate the long diagonal or support an invasion on d4. Black takes e6 with the knight, maintaining central coordination. Black recaptures with the knight, which centralizes and frees the remaining bishop from blocking duties. White plays bishop e3, placing the bishop on a stable central diagonal. The bishop guards d4 and c5 while giving white a stable piece for the technical ending. After examining the immediate queen exchange, return to the modern move order. White castles first, keeps the queen on the board for one more move, and reaches a different strategic setup. White removes black's central pawn and asks whether black's piece activity compensates for the quieter structure. White castles kingside before deciding whether queens should be traded. This is the primary move order in this lesson. Black keeps the rook ready for the d-file once the d-pawn leaves d6. Black plays knight c6, increasing central pressure. White plays bishop g5, pinning the knight and making d5 more important. The pin makes nx d5 less automatic and increases the tactical value of a white knight jump to d5. Black takes d1 with the queen, forcing the queenless middle game on favorable move order terms. Black chooses the timing of the queen trade after white has castled, changing which rook can recapture. White takes d1 with the f-rook, immediately using the open file. Using the f-rook places it directly opposite black's rook while preserving the a-rook for c-file pressure. Black plays bishop g4, pinning the knight and increasing pressure on the center. The pin makes the e4 pawn harder to defend because the knight on f3 cannot move freely. White plays h3, asking the bishop to declare its intentions. White gains the bishop pair question, but must judge whether the h-pawn move creates useful hooks for black. Black takes f3, changing the minor piece balance before the d-file becomes too favorable for white. Black trades the active bishop to damage white's coordination before white can use the d-file with both minor pieces. White takes f3 with the bishop and keeps the pawn structure intact. Black trades the active bishop to damage white's coordination before white can use the d-file with both minor pieces. Black plays knight d4. The knight reaches the key square that white cannot defend with a pawn. A knight on d4 attacks c2, e2, and f3 while being immune to a pawn chase. That is the strategic point of black's setup. White plays knight d5, challenging black's central coordination before the outpost becomes permanent. The move challenges black before d4 becomes permanent and often forces a structural decision with nx d5. Black takes d5 with the knight, removing white's active piece. Black eliminates the knight because allowing it to remain would expose c7 and f6 and restrict the bishops. White takes d5 with the c-pawn, creating space but also a fixed target. The capture removes white's central space and gives black open lines for rooks and bishops. Black plays f5, challenging white's center and gaining activity on the king side. Black attacks e4 and tries to open the f-file before white's rooks can exploit the queenside files. White plays rook ac1, increasing pressure before black's pieces consolidate. The rook supports c-file pressure and prepares to meet black's central breaks with active pieces rather than passive defense. Black plays rook f7, supporting the f-pawn and preparing further exchanges. The rook supports f5 and can swing along the 7th rank to defend weak pawns after the center opens. White plays king f1. With queens gone, the king steps toward the center and clears the g-file rook if needed. With queens gone, the king can improve toward the center while stepping out of potential bishop checks on the long diagonal. Black takes e4, opening lines while white's pieces are active. Black removes white's e4 anchor. The resulting open lines make piece activity more valuable than the pawn count. White takes e4 with the bishop, preserving development and central control. White chooses a piece recapture so the bishop becomes active immediately and the rooks retain open files. Black plays bishop f8, improving the bishop and keeping the remaining pieces coordinated. The bishop reroutes away from a blocked diagonal and prepares to defend key dark squares in the ending. The delayed queen exchange line is a fight over d4, d5, and the f-file. White must not allow the knight on d4 to become permanent. Black must use f5 and active pieces before white's rooks dominate the open files. The bishop reroutes away from a blocked diagonal and prepares to defend key dark squares in the ending. The alternatives come first because they explain the main line. Immediate queen exchange leads to tactical pawn grab and central transformation branches. The delayed queen exchange leads to knight c6, queen takes d1, bishop g4, and the battle for d4. In every line, calculate before simplifying. Black keeps the rook ready for the d-file once the d-pawn leaves d6.